DARE stands for Discernment and Radical Engagement. Since 2018, CWM's DARE evolved on three platforms. There are the DARE resources for church use in the forms of Bible studies and handbooks that explain topics in relation to the focus and themes of CWM, for instance, doing theology and reading the Bible in the context of empires.
Second, there are the DARE forums, which bring together theologians, biblical scholars, and activists to share their wisdom and present papers on various topics, again in relation to the themes and focus of CWM, but with openness to insights in the fields of theological and religious studies. The presenters include men and women, older and younger folk, church and non-church folk, scholars and students from the Global South and the Global North.
And not least, we have the DARE publications. Several, but not all of the papers from the DARE forums are revised and published so that they are available as resources for theological education.
COVID-19 has infected us with another platform, an online one. We cannot hold the 2020 DARE Forum as planned, so we are introducing eDARE for 2020. eDARE will be webinars with presentations by people from different parts of the world, from China, India, South Korea, Africa, Switzerland, UK, Germany, the Netherlands, Jamaica, USA, Argentina, Brazil, Australia, and Fiji.
There will also be poets to help us reflect on the presentations, as well as a panel on the final session of the webinars to engage the artworks of two Filipino artists. Poets and artists have ways of thinking that can help church and academic folk think, function, and step out of our comfort zones into spaces full of surprises and excitement. So, welcome to this platform and this event of eDARE.
Good evening to you in the Caribbean and Americas. Good morning and good afternoon to those of us who are Zooming and Facebooking from other parts of the world. This webinar is being recorded and broadcast on Facebook. On Zoom, we now post poll questions on your screen and ask you, the audience, to please answer those two questions, which will help us plan for future events. This is the first of 3 eDARE webinars for the Caribbean and Americas, in which we reflect on the impact of COVID-19 on how we live, learn, think, do theology and church in this so-called new normal, and whether we want to go back to the old normal or what is normal from this point onward. This evening, we have 3 presentations on issues related to the body, to healing, and to the need for community-centered harmony between humans and creation. Our first presenter, Anna Kasafi Perkins, is with the University of the West Indies, St. Michael's Theological College, Kingston, Jamaica. Lim Sung Uk is with the College of Theology and United Graduate School of Theology, Yonsei University, South Korea. And Angelica Tostes and Delana Corazza are researchers with the Tri-Continental Institute for Social Research, Brazil. A warm welcome to our presenters. Welcome also to Karen Georgia Thompson, who will be offering a poetic benediction. Karen Georgia is the Associate General Minister of Global Ministries and Operations and co-executive for Global Ministries with the United Church of Christ. I now welcome and invite Karen Francis, who is the CWM Mission Secretary for the Caribbean, as well as the coordinator of the Partner in Mission program of CWM, to offer a short message on behalf of CWM. Karen Francis.
Brothers and sisters, what a guan! That is one of the ways Caribbean folks greet others. In Jamaica, anyway. It means what's going on with you. Well, we know what's going on in the world. COVID-19 is on everybody's mind and directing the course of personal and community activity, whether that community is family or church or nation. So it stands to reason that an organization such as Council for World Mission would think it important to engage that conversation, and as we have always done, take it to the market square, the verandas, the pulpit, and of course, into cyberspace. The Caribbean is a place where we like to dare to be more than others perceive or assign us to be. So we welcome DARE to our Caribbean seas and will add our own pepper pot or mixture of flavor, color, and perspectives to the God talk. Were it not for COVID-19, I would have welcomed you with some rum punch or coconut water. As Mission Secretary in the Caribbean region, I warmly welcome you. We are a hospitable people. We love when people come to visit. We take out the good china to make sure you're comfortable and that you feel special. I pray that God will guide our thought and our talk, and at the end of our time together, our bellies will be full, our bodies and minds energized to continue to work towards life in fullness, life flourishing communities. Welcome.
Thank you, Karen Francis. I personally look forward to that coconut water and the rum and anything stronger that you might have to offer. I'm open. Our three presentations this evening. First presentation is by Anna Perkins. Please note that Anna is present for that discussion time, but she pre-recorded her presentation, and in the recording her voice is gentle. So please turn up the volume in your devices in order for you to hear Anna better. Her presentation title is "We Put Off This Mortal Coil, the Body in COVID." So we go to Anna now.
Hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. The title of my presentation is taken from a letter to the editor of the Jamaica Observer newspaper, in which someone called George Garwood assures us that in putting off our mortal coil, we would soon return to our eternal home, heaven. So Garwood penned this meditation on mortality, eternal life, and the afterlife in response to the deadliness of the COVID pandemic, which, like most pandemics, engenders deeper philosophical and religious reflections. So what he does is that he attempts to provide a word of hope with a type of cosmic theology that moves beyond the very mortal coil, which I consider to be, and when I talk about mortal coil, I'm talking about the body and its attendant afflictions and sufferings, and then ultimately death. I juxtapose his letter to a poem entitled Collage that was done by St. Lucian poet John Robert Lee, and John's one of my absolute favorite Caribbean poets. And this is a part of what John says. He asks, who would think that pestilence is ravaging our world? No safe zone on continent or island. Familiar routines locked down, family, friends, lovers masked and distanced, networks obsessed with flattening curves and death statistics, churches and mosques closed except for fanatics, beaches, bars, brothels shut except for the skeptics or those who want normal here and now. And there are us who must crowd long lines outside shops. Who wrote the script? Who configured this incredible dystopia? Judgment is dropping abroad from our mouths and our hands. What unbelievable drama is rolling out behind the scenes? Who is moving Ephesians to the center stage of this cosmic scenario? Just so beautiful, so profound. I really thank John Robert Lee for giving me the opportunity to reflect on and just to eat up the beauty of his words. Now, I don't believe that John Robert Lee takes the same stance that Garwood does, because I don't think he stands back from the concreteness of this mortal coil. He doesn't want to quickly escape from it, So he works with the concreteness of empty brothels or shut churches, even as he faces the pandemic's cosmic, dystopian, and eschatological import. In fact, I think he draws my attention when he asks the question, what is moving center stage? When he asks that question, for me, he draws my attention to the body. His concreteness centers our mortal coil on bodies and how they're treated in the Caribbean, a region which is born out of and deeply marked by inequalities that exclude and marginalize and deeply, deeply reject. So when we look at the virus and what the virus is doing, we can talk about it attacking not only individual physical bodies, but also communal bodies, racialized bodies, gendered bodies, poor bodies. And look, it does so disproportionately. And in doing so, it exploits and deepens these existing fault lines that I've already identified. So simultaneously, in our response to the pandemic, what I also see are the deeper attitude that we have towards the body. Those attitudes that we have are made clear by how we treat the body in the pandemic. And so what I see in that are implied theologies of the body, which shape the way society treats the body. And in the Caribbean, Christianity has been an important shaper of theologies of the body, as well as a means of socialization into how to treat the body. I find Christianity having an ambiguous impact, as it both subordinates the body while it also empowers the body and presents the body as a site of creativity and justice even. Now, the body question is important for me as an African-descended, Jamaican-born, Roman Catholic woman theologian. Bodies like mine have been continually devalued and misrepresented by political, religious systems. So when I look at COVID and I ask questions of the body, I dare to question the meaning of the body as it has been laid bare or even made barer by the pandemic. And so what I'm doing is I'm quickly pointing out some situations from the Caribbean where the pandemic and how we treat bodies indicates the value that has been given to bodies. And I'm specifically thinking about certain kind of working bodies that have been framed as loose, and, believe it or not, dead bodies. And I don't by any means want to suggest that those three situations exhaust the challenge that COVID-19 poses to us on the meaning of the body, but it simply serves to highlight the complexities of the situation that we're dealing with. So why don't we begin at the end with dead bodies, yeah? And dead bodies are bodies that make us uncomfortable because these bodies have shuffled off their mortal coil and are the ultimate expression of our mortality. Different societies have different protocols for how they're going to treat the dead from the pandemic, and most tend to want to treat the dead in a way that sees them as being contaminating. Therefore, they have to protect the living from the dead. So in many cases, these emergency situations, you find that dead bodies are no longer considered to be sacred, no longer treated with the kind of respect that they would have been in the past. And so on the contrary, they're even seen as a source of worry or fear by the government and also by many people. The fear and worry that attends dead bodies during pandemic, I think, is also compounded by the fact that cultural and religious rituals for preparing and sending the deceased off on a journey to the afterlife while allowing the living to grieve and to celebrate have been curtailed and been distant during the pandemic. More troubling for me, however, is the rejection of dead bodies. Dead bodies are no longer respected but feared and fearsome. And in Jamaica, initially, some funeral homes actually refused to accept and prepare them for burial. Further compounding the grief of families, many of whom would already have been stigmatized and shunned from their communities to begin with. Many people have been threatened and felt threatened and been forced to leave communities because of the fear that COVID engenders. So let's go on to working bodies. What about working bodies? Innumerable Caribbean people have lost their jobs and livelihoods due to the pandemic. Among the most affected, to my mind, are migrant workers. And they ply their trade both inside and outside of the region. There's quite a migrant trade inside the Caribbean among the Anglophone Caribbean islands. But many more migrant workers undertake farm work in North America under seasonal agricultural workers programs, and they're often designated as essential workers, yet they're generally not covered by national health schemes. All right, loose bodies. Now, the material experiences of sex workers during COVID is another site for reflection and interrogation. Sex workers are already involved in an industry which is fraught with danger, moral opprobrium, and discrimination. And they're portrayed as loose, they're immoral, they're criminal, they're vectors of disease, and some of them are considered to be, many if not all, victims of trafficking. With COVID, of course, there's been a curtailment of the sex trade, especially with the lockdown and curfews, and they're left unprotected, increasingly vulnerable and unable to care for themselves and their families. So what conclusions and considerations can we come to? I think attention needs to be drawn to the inequalities that disproportionately affect bodies that are desacralized, criminalized, marginalized, and that live in financially precarious situations, often outside of systems of respect, health, and social protection. However, living in a pandemic does not change the fundamental duty we have to respect and care for others and for ourselves. Living in a pandemic does not change the requirement of justice, that the vulnerable and disadvantaged farm worker should not bear harm more than anyone else for the benefit of the larger community. Living in a pandemic does not change the requirement of justice, that the deceased deserve to be treated with respect and that their loved ones be afforded new and safe opportunities to mourn and celebrate. Living in a pandemic does not change the requirement of justice, that sex workers be recognized as full members of the society and be afforded respect and protection in keeping with their human dignity. Furthermore, the impact of COVID-19 on these bodies, I believe, highlights vulnerability as a moral concept, which requires some further exploration. When we talk about vulnerability captures the capriciousness of the human condition, or something, like the concept of moral luck. But it also refers to a state of being which is created and intensified by unjust social conditions. By recognizing this distinction, we can discriminate between the vulnerability that we experience as human beings, vulnerability to suffering that is caused by the virus on the one hand, and the particular injustice that groups like sex workers, migrant workers, deceased persons, and others face during the pandemic on the other. The true meaning of vulnerability to our mortal coil bears further and deeper exploration. Thank you very much.
Thank you to that powerful way of getting us started. We start with the body and those disposable bodies, and how do we account for them? How do we face them in this context? And the pandemic is not an excuse to disadvantage the already disadvantaged. So we'll come back in our discussion time to talk more about what Anna has presented. If you are listening through Zoom and you have a question, please type your question in the Q&A feature of Zoom. And if you're on Facebook, you can just do it on the comment function of Facebook. Our second presentation, we go to Lim Sung Uk, who is presenting on the title of his presentation, Touch of Jesus in the Era of Untech. So Sung Uk.
Okay, I'm going to share my PPT with all of you. Can you find my PPT well?
Yes.
Okay, let me just start my presentation. What is the meaning of the touch of Jesus in the time of Untact? The corona pandemic is challenging and changing the whole world to make the public health as top priority. In order to prevent the spread of the virus, the vast majority of global citizens have recently made a habit to maintain social distancing, which is designed to make lesser or non-contact with others in daily life, not to mention religious life. In this situation, we may beg a question. What is the meaning of divine touch or just touch in a touchless society? This essay wrestles with the meaning of healing by dint of divine touch in the time of Untact, which safety is believed to be guaranteed only through the sheer lack of contact with others. My contention is that Jesus' touch operates as a gesture of boundary crossing over the norms of purity in antiquity. Furthermore, Jesus' symbolic action of touching encourages us even to imagine the meaning of touchless touch, a new phenomenon generated in the Untact time, a divine intervention in human suffering in the post-coronavirus era. Now, we can think about divergent understanding of touch in philosophy and religion. This is a quote from Candy Gunther Braun. The sense of touch is foundational to human, indeed to all animal experiences and influences religious life. Touch is at once a physiologically based perception grounded in receptor neurons, concentrated in the skin, and evokes affective and metaphorical meanings, as in a touching experience, getting in touch, or reach out and touch someone to express rational, relational connection and empathy, end of quote. What's the meaning of touch in Western philosophy? Western philosophy has a long-standing tendency to denigrate sense per se in the process of seeking the truth, with the conviction that it is unceasingly liable to change and is by no means as truthful as it seems. For instance, in the ancient Greek philosophy, Plato cast aspersions on senses on the ground that they are in nature mendacious and fallacious. In a similar vein, Aristotle goes even so far as to set up the hierarchies of senses in a way that places the sense of vision at the highest level and that of touch at the lowest level. It is important to remember that touch is often placed at the bottom in the philosophical thinking. What is the meaning of touch in religion? On the contrary, touch in the realm of religious thinking can be differently construed as a modus operandi to heal those suffering from illness. As noted earlier, touch serves to communicate to the others, conveying their emotions. Especially when people experience agony in the course of life, touch becomes a crucial medium for the other to express his, her empathetic feeling for them. Furthermore, touch is also believed to be a means to alleviate suffering in the process of healing. This is based on the belief that divine touch is able to entail pain relief and, most importantly, ultimate healing. It should be kept in mind that we can also find the hierarchy of the senses even in religion. which is somewhat distinguishable from that in philosophy. For instance, hearing as a way of hearing the word of God can be held to be more important than any other senses. Yet, the key point is that touch was deemed to be an important way of communication between divine and human beings in early Christianity. Taken together, it is ironic to state that touch, the sense of which is considered as the most effective in philosophical thinking, plays a vital role in revealing the willingness for God to participate in human sufferings with a view to generating the power of healing. Let us think about Jesus' healing touch through boundary crossing in Mark's Gospel. In this section, I will delve into the episode that relate to the event of Jesus' touch and that of Jesus being touched in the Markan Gospel. The first episode concerns Jesus' healing of the leper, begging him to cleanse his leprosy. In response, Jesus reaches out his hand and touches him, giving an order that he may be clean. It is worth noting that leprosy in Jesus' time was deemed so infectious that a leper was forced to live alone outside the Jewish community. In this way, Jesus himself infringed Jewish purity codes, which are intended to keep away from infectious diseases through his touch on the leper's body. The second episode deals with Jesus' raising of the daughter of Jairus. Aware that his daughter is on the verge of death, Jairus asks Jesus to come and lay his hands in order that she may be saved and live. From this, it follows that Jairus already knows the healing effect of Jesus' touch before his encounter with him. It's interesting to observe that Jesus does grasp the dead body of Jairus' daughter to raise her from death. Remember that touching, of course, was considered to contribute to Jewish purity code in antiquity for religious and unquestionably hygienic reasons. The third episode involves Jesus' restoration of the deaf man. It is shocking to see Jesus putting his fingers into his ears, spitting, and touching his tongue. Jesus adamantly crossed over the physical demarcation between himself and the deaf man by dint of his unrestrained touch. No doubt, Jesus does not care about any potential contamination for the sake of his open ministry. The fourth episode recounts Jesus' cure of a blind man at Bethsaida. Jesus is requested to touch the blind man for the sake of the recovery of sight. And in the second episode, the healing power of Jesus by touch must have been well known to people at Bethsaida. What is interesting is that Jesus puts his saliva to the eyes of the blind man, laying his hands on him. Seen from the Jewish perspective, it would be a default action to apply one's own emission to someone else's body in accordance with ritual purity. The final episode is described the healing of a hemorrhaging woman by her touch on Jesus' clothes. In marked distinction from the rest of the episode, Jesus is stealthily touched by a woman. It would be astonishing to read the reader to detect that even touching the clothes had the power to heal the ill. This time, it is the hemorrhaging woman who contravened the bodily boundaries by dauntlessly touching Jesus, even though she is more likely to be deemed unclean due to the flow of blood. All things considered, it is remarkable that Jesus healed the sick by his touch alone, and what is more, had the audacity to violate Jewish purity code in his healing ministry. The end result is that he breaks down social and cultural barriers between the sick and the healthy, between the pure and the impure, between the imprivileged and the marginal in first century Jewish society. In this regard, Jesus can be seen as a boundary breaker in the Markan healing episodes. Conclusion. What are the implications of Jesus' touch? It is through his touch of healing that Jesus breaks down social and cultural barriers between pure and impure, between man and woman, between the wealthy and the poor, between the privileged and the marginalized, in order to create a more inclusive society. I believe it is incumbent on us all to imitate Jesus' indomitable gesture of getting in touch with those suffering in the post-coronavirus era, crossing over social and cultural boundaries today. Thank you very much for your listening.
Thank you, Sung-uk. It's quite interesting. Things is beginning to form in my mind where Anna is lamenting the hands-off attitude of the society and the governments, and you are wanting the hands-on, and us to affirm the touching, the hands-on approach of Jesus. Our third presentation is a team presentation between Telana and Angelica, and they speak of a different kind of touch. And the title for their presentation is Latin American Spiritualities in Times of COVID-19, Social Movements and Solidarity Actions as Resistance. So, Delana and Angelica.
Dear all, it's such a pleasure to be here with you. Although I would like to meet you this person this year, but unfortunately it wasn't possible. I'm Angelica Tostes, theologian and research at Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. It's important to mention that the institute is deeply connected with social movement and popular movement around the world. And now I will call my partner of research, Delana Coraza. She will do greetings in Portuguese, and I will help her with translate.
Boa noite a todos. Sou Delana, cientista social e pesquisadora do Instituto Tricontinental de Pesquisa Social. Junto com a Angélica Tostes, coordeno a pesquisa Os Evangélicos e a Política. Estou muito feliz em participar desse encontro e conhecer as diversas vozes das tantas lutas desse momento que vivemos, de muitas dificuldades, medos, mas também de esperança. Obrigada.
And she said, good evening, I'm Delana. I'm social scientist and research at Tricontinental Institute. I'm coordinating with Angelica the research of Pentecostalism and politics. I'm very happy to be here and listen to the different voices of so many struggle in this moment of difficult, fierce, but also full of hope. And so Delana and I are engaging with the research about what the activists bring in their backpack. We and other research of the Institute interviewed 18 activists of Periferia Viva, Living Periphery, that we'll talk more about it later, to understand. In this amazing conversation that we had, the aspect of spirituality was raised when we asked about what do they think about popular solidarity. However, we start our reflection questioning, what is spirituality? Does spirituality need a label or a divine human relationship? Or spirituality is beyond our creeds, institution, and theological religious walls? Well, for the theologian Gustavo Gutierrez, already pointed to us in Latin America, is a connection with the body. Taking into consideration, the spirituality of social movement is connected with the concept of buen vivir. Buen vivir is harmony between human beings and also between human beings and nature. For who are believer with the creation. Buen vivir is a wide concept, not well translatable in English or even in Portuguese, because it's not a well-being promoted by the capitalism, but buen vivir is a challenge the economic model, forms of development, and the way we immerse in consumerism. Therefore, why the spirituality in Latin America has this cornerstone, the body, the reality? Because in Abya Yala, we are engaged with the body of the coloniality. So we brought the discussion about coloniality because it's the legacy of colonialism in minds, bodies, and knowledge. All poverty and inequality is a part of the global south as a result of these years of exploitation of our people and land. And then we work with the social movement like the landless rural workers movement, rights work movement, and popular consultation, popular oath uprising, to understand what these people are engaging against the necropolitics of Bolsonaro here in Brazil. Because I was listening this the Sunken Lin, for here is a civil disobedience, stay home, because the president doesn't care about life, but the economic issues first of people. So the resistance of this popular movement is with the solidarity. And we can mention the donation of food without the poison, the training of popular agents of the health, people of the territory taking care of the street, giving assistance to reivindicate their own rights, and inspire the whole community to organize themselves and question why we are hungry. So we call popular solidarity because what is the difference of this word, popular solidarity? We inspired by Paulo Freire's works of popular education that understand that everyone engaging in education process participates and everyone has something to share and receive. It's not a vertical thing. It's a based relationship between those who have and those who donate. So it's not a passive thing, but it's active thing of the community help themselves. And in this period of pandemic, activists of social movement have put the body into a risk, dealing with a government that is not concerned about the lives, but are concerned about the economic issues. For the activist Lucas Lemos, he said solidarity is a risk. So also our spirituality must be a risk to put ourselves in to help the others, despite of religions and gods. And to finish, we are rediscovering the spirituality in Latin America, based in a mystical of the social movement, connect with the harmony and engaging with all living beings. Spirituality and solidarity action can be a resistance, not a part of the fundamentalist project in Brazil and Latin America. I want to finish with some verses by Pedro Tierra. Organize hope, lead the storm, break through the walls of the night, creating without asking permission of a world of freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Delana and Angelica, for bringing this matter of spirituality back into our discussion on the body, and how do we deal with that aspect of existence, the aspect of life. I find it quite interesting that you bring in a different form of tact, if I can just borrow Sung Uk's label. Untech is our time of COVID-19, but you refer to coloniality, which is contact from our side in the Pacific. But what's interesting now is coloniality is not coming from outside. It's not the colonialists who brought the diseases. The coloniality in Brazil and the US and many other places, coloniality is within the borders where you are. So now we shift, and thank you for keeping the time for the three presentations. Now we shift to the Q&A, and we will move in three stages. First, give you, the presenters, an opportunity to ask questions of each other or make comments, or you see other links between your presentations. I apologize if I have kind of hijacked what you were trying to do individually and thinking that there is some connection between them, but you might see different connections. So I invite you to speak with one another. That's our first step. Second, there are other people in the room that they can ask questions. Penny Liu and Monica Melanchthon and Michael Chekasa and others who are here. And third, we'll take some comments or questions from our audience. So, but first, Anna, Sung-uk, Delana, and Angelica, do you have questions or comments with one another?
Sure.
Anna, okay.
Sure. Thank you very much. I thank my fellow panelists for their presentations, which were so rich. And I really did see lots of connections across our presentations. Certainly if we were to focus on the body and the whole question of touch and contact. So I got so many things from that where I could forever think, for instance, think of the leper and those that were lepers in the time of Jesus being in permanent quarantine. You know, they were put and placed outside of the community such that their lives were lived in permanent isolation. What does that do to their humanity? Can we consider them to be truly human if we're not allowing them to be parts of our community and that they have been shaped as contaminants? So not only the dead can contaminate, but certainly in these spaces we're seeing where, because of how we're interpreting COVID and what we're being asked to do to protect ourselves, we view even live bodies as contaminants. So there's some stuff that's going on there that I think we could bear some deeper reflection on. Then I'm thinking too that Lim did take us in an interesting direction about touch and the value and the importance of it, because if we think about it, even the deaf, even the blind, even those that don't have the higher order, the use of the higher order senses, have to use the one that's at the bottom. So is there a way that that one really ought to be flipped on its head and it becomes even more valuable than we're giving it cause to be seen to be? You know, touch is really a lot more valuable perhaps than we're really giving it that kind of interpretation. And the truth is, how are we called now, as Christ was, to break those boundaries, to break the socially imposed barriers that really are in place, not just against bodies that are contaminating because they have a virus, but bodies that are contaminating or contaminated because they're gendered in a certain way, because they're racialized in certain ways, you know, because they're poor in other ways. So, you know, there might be something else that's going on there in terms of the call that we have to break down boundaries. And I see that happening concretely in what Angelica and Delana have done. I like the connection with the workers' movement, because I see the connection with that, with my own wrestling with what we do with our migrant worker population in the Caribbean, just as how I saw in Lim's presentation connections to with dead bodies and contaminating bodies and so on. And I'm very much taken with this whole notion of a colonial body, the colonial body. We all function as colonial bodies in a certain way. So there's something going on there that I think bears some reflection. I also like what the ladies did with the notion of popular solidarity in a context of spirituality. Because, you know, normally when you think about spirituality, it's all this airy-fairy, one-on-one personal relationship with Christ and how you have the spirit in your life and so on. But no, what the ladies are saying is that concretely, to speak about spirituality is really akin to a kind of popular solidarity that is calling for us to actually feed people, to actually fight for their human rights, to actually ensure that their health is protected. So I'm seeing some really great connections all across our three presentations.
Thank you, Anna. Sung-uk, did you want to follow that up? Or? or Angelica?
I think, are you listening? I do agree with you, and I was very touched by your paper when I read. I share with Delana about how I felt when I read this, because I'm also a feminist theologian here in Brazil. So we cannot think theology without the body, without the oppressive of our bodies, without this coloniality that we felt in our own bodies, even though in a different places, this coloniality, this heritage, this legacy of colonialism still is in your minds and even in your spirituality. So even now, and I would like to continue this conversation with you, because I really like the part of the sex labor. And I was talking with a trans pastor here in Brazil, and she said that the trans women in Brazil are suffering a lot because there's a thousand of oppressive in this body, and the vulnerability in this process of pandemic are rising. So nobody cares. So for me, while you were talking and while I was listening the presentation, the question for me is, what bodies matters? Who must live in this necropolitics? And I can share about Brazil and some countries here in Latin America. These necropolitics are really, how can I say this? Are really put this body in front line and say, it doesn't matter. Like the Bolsonaro say, it's just a little flu. It's not a pandemic. So for me, this is the point. For our spirituality, for our engaging in theology, reflection, when we're talking about theology, what bodies are immersive in this theology?
Sunguk, did you want to?
Yeah, can I follow you up? Actually, I really appreciate all your kind of different, all the papers. I learned a lot from you guys, and I can see kind of connection. And I really appreciate kind of the contextualization of the text, right? So I can learn kind of different kind of context. But I think I've gotten one insight from your comments about my paper, especially when it comes to the gender body. Especially the hemorrhaging women, and I want to kind of think more deeply about the relation between Jesus and the hemorrhaging woman. Okay, it is just the woman who touches even the clothes of Jesus, and I think I can find kind of the meaning of what a gender boundary. Okay, and then in that case, the woman has kind of agency of touching Jesus' body. So even though I emphasize Jesus' agency of crossing boundaries, I believe in the case of the hemorrhaging woman, it's a woman who dares to touch the body of Jesus or his clothes. So I believe when you kind of deal with kind of the meaning of touch in a touchless society today, we have to think about kind of touch or contact in various ways, as you said, like. We have to think about the cross boundaries in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation, and so on. So, and at the same time, we have to think about kind of multi-dimension. So, I really appreciate kind of your comments. And on top of that, I'm trying to kind of a meaning of touch in today's society. I have not yet found the real meaning yet, in the sense that because I'm thinking about kind of the meaning of a touchless touch. Okay, in Korean society, we are not supposed to touch. Okay, even though we may kind of have a touch with others, we may try to sanitize our hands immediately, right? That's a kind of a society kind of habit. That's a very kind of new kind of phenomenon. But and I'm thinking about kind of how can we touch each other. Many pastors would like to kind of broadcast their kind of worship services, and unfortunately, there's a kind of discrimination between wealthier and poorer churches. The wealthier churches wouldn't have no problem because their broadcast system is so great, but in the case of poorer churches, they have lesser resources and kind of few specialists who can help the church leaders or the church itself. Therefore, even in the case of kind of virtual society, okay, a kind of touch through kind of media is not equal. Even though in my paper I do not address the issue, I'm really kind of critical about this new phenomenon of grounded in kind of economic kind of inequality. So the Jesus kind of touch in a touchless way is maybe kind of limited by kind of economic inequality. I'm still trying to kind of give an answer to that question too. Yeah.
Thank you. Can I please allow me to push you a little on this issue of being touched? What does being touched mean in the context of artificial intelligence, where we don't need to be, to be physically touch each other? There's in a way that technology allow us to touch each other from so far away, and artificial intelligence and media kind of, and this goes to the previous session, they kind of break down our usual notion of time and space. Yeah, because you're there in Seoul, and you do your presentation, and we can see it as if you are right in front of us. So there's virtuality is the new kind of truth. What does touch mean in this context? If COVID-19 is giving us a so-called new normal, and this new normal is where we have virtuality, I can see your smiles, I can see your annoyance, or I can see your hope, and where, but touch has a different feel, or does it not? If I can throw that at you, what does touch mean in our current context? Not just the untech, where don't touch, because if you touch, you'll get infected, but untouched yet touch through this virtuality, this technology. Any thoughts on that?
You're to the panel or to Lim in particular?
Let me start with Lim. Sorry, Lim Sunguk, and then the panel.
That's the very question that I'm still struggling with, to be honest with you. As I said, kind of virtuality is limited only to kind of the wealthier rather than the poorer, even in the context of kind of education. Yeah, in this kind of situation, the richer would have no problem in educating their children. On the contrast, the poorer would have so much trouble in educating them. And then I'm kind of trying to as a post-colonial critic, I'm very confronted with this kind of reality. Virtuality is not fair, even though people may think their way. And then I try to kind of get to the kind of meaning of touch in, as you said, kind of in a virtual kind of level. I believe what is meant by touch? I believe touch is a kind of a medium to kind of convey one's emotion to the other, right? So this is my kind of interpretation. AI may create a virtual reality which we may feel as if we were connected to each other, right? That's right. But what about the feeling, the emotion? I believe the greatest benefit from touch is that we can feel the emotion of the others. We can feel the agony of the others, right? So my question is, how can you convey our emotion in a touchless kind of society? That's my question. And then I would say that it's kind of call it kind of holy touch. And I'm even in this my paper, I did not kind of connect my question to the function of the Holy Spirit. So I believe there must be kind of the function of Holy Spirit, which can connect our touch's touch to a feeling of kind of or emotions. So without the function of the Holy Spirit, it will be almost impossible. I believe, as I said, AI may create a virtual reality in which you may feel as if you were connected to each other, but how can we communicate our feeling to the others? So that's my question. I'm trying to answer the question directly, but I do not want to give a kind of quick answer to the question because, as I said, there are so many kind of factors that have to be considered. For example, kind of economic inequality or gender inequality or racial inequality. There are so many kind of inequalities even in the virtual society. That's my answer to your question.
Thank you, Sung. Yeah, Anna or Angelica?
Yeah, I was thinking a couple of things. I like Lim's response, but I take it slightly differently. I can see us moving in a direction with virtual reality such that you virtually can experience the touch of the other. So the way the fourth revolution is taking us, it's possible that we're going to get to the point where that kind of touch can be conveyed virtually. So there is something that's going on there that we have to take account of. I also think of the virtual and the whole notion of touch having to do with communication. And we talk about keeping in touch. So the touch and the way we touch the other has to be done in a way that conveys the regard that we continue to have for the other, even though there's distance and there's isolation. So even as I lament the isolation that's in place, I'm searching after possibilities and potential to remain in and to continue to be in touch. And that way of being in touch actually ties in, I think, with some of what Angelica is pointing out in terms of the social movements and so on. To be in touch with, to give regard to the other means that you're going to find ways of breaking down the barriers that are there. You're going to find ways of breaking down the inequalities that exist. So we need to feed people. We need to clothe them. We need to make sure that they're respected, whether they're transgender sex workers or not. And we need to ensure that all that prevents them from being full members of our society, those barriers are broken down.
Thank you. Angelica?
I do agree with Anna. Are you listening?
Yes, your voice is breaking up. I'm there. Maybe we'll take some comments and questions from other people who are in the room or in the audience, and we'll come back to Angelica's question.
Sione, I have a couple of questions here. Could you want me to?
Yes, go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, so I'll start with the one from my former colleague, Gary Harriott, who has a question here. It says, how do we resolve the tension that exists between the need to touch and be touched on the one hand, and the prescriptive that touch is a main means of transmitting the virus? So there's a tension between the need to be touched, to touch and to be touched on the one hand, and the understanding and perspective that touch then becomes a means of transmitting a virus. So you resolve the tension. So that's one question. And then there's a question from Brian Collier. You want me to do that, read that one as well? And that question goes like this. In the touch by the woman with hemorrhage, there was a hectic search for who touched Jesus. In experiencing the touch, how important is understanding, deciphering, and paying attention to who is touching us? Okay.
Yep, so we have two questions there. Tation Benny Liu, and I have another question. Is it related in this area, Benny, or? Okay, so we'll try those two questions, Sunguk and Anna, and wait to see if Angelica will come back.
Sure. I'd answer Gary's question by saying that, just as how we're thinking through the AI connection and the evolution of our lives that has to take place, that is taking place because of COVID, but certainly also too because of how we're interacting with these technologies. We're called upon to evolve ways that are safer. So just think about, Gary, for example, nowadays, how we greet each other is an elbow touch, you know? So there are ways that we will evolve, and that's what human beings do. We are going to find ways of evolving actions and activities that give meaning to what it is that we're trying to do. So no touch, isolation, but in a process of evolution is how I would answer that. And that there's no perfect way, but what ought not to happen is that or untouched or untact means total cutting off from the other, because that's just not feasible for us as human beings. It would mean death. Go ahead, Sione. There's a second question, but I'll allow Lim to speak, and then we can always
Okay, thank you.
my response to the second one.
I'm trying to answer the question of Michael. I'm not sure, I may not kind of understand the question itself clearly. Could you repeat your question again, Michael, just in case?
Okay, yeah, the question is from Gary. How do we resolve the tension that exists between the need, you're saying it's a human thing to want to touch and to be touched, and that's on the one hand, and on the other hand, touch then becomes the means to transmit a virus. How do you resolve?
Yeah. So that's my real question. I just said, in my society, it not be a kind of it's socially banned to touch the others, okay? And even though we may touch the other, we may try to use kind of sanitizer immediately. So I'm not saying that we have to touch the other in a kind of physical manner. I'm just saying that how can you understand this kind of physical kind of touch of Jesus in a kind of in today's society? And then I'm trying to kind of interpret the text in a symbolic manner. So how can you reinterpret the meaning of Jesus' touch in today's society? How can we apply a new meaning to today's society? As I told you, I'm still struggling to find the answer, but as I said, there are some factors yet to be considered, and I need to be kind of, I don't know, but I like your kind of general question, that appears on the chatting box. So you said kind of there is kind of certain kinds of bodies are further marginalized and denigrated, right? But let me think about, for example, kind of body of the homeless people, right? In this kind of situation, the body of the homeless may be even more denigrated because we may think that they may kind of convey more virus than the other people, right? Because of for the hygienic reason. And then in that case, for example, how can we approach them? How can we kind of serve them? Or how can we kind of have some kind of fair conversation with them? Actually, several years ago, I used to participate in kind of the services for the homeless, right? But in this kind of situation, how can we have some kind of koinonia in an equal manner? So that's not easier to answer the question because of the hygiene issue. So my question is, even though the medical hygienic issue may prevent us from touching the other, how can we get in touch with the others in a symbolic way, or how can we get reconnected to the others? I don't have any kind of real answers because I'm not a scientist, but as a kind of church member and a church leader, how can I resolve that kind of question? What's the kind of real solutions? So that's my question that I'm trying to answer. Yeah. And then I believe you will have to try to answer the question altogether.
Thank you. I mean, we just have to accept that some questions are out of touch for our thinking at the moment. But Benny had a question first, and then Monica and Angelica, and then.
And I have a few more questions here as well.
Okay, yeah, Benny.
I actually have several questions, but I will just start with one. So I want to begin with what Anna said about bodies that work. I want to ask questions about two different types of labor. So touchless touch that the Song Lim talked about reminds me of emotional labor. And I remember reading Avery Ibsen's book, Sex Working on the Bible, where the sex workers said actually most of the people who solicit their services actually not looking for just sex, because sex only takes like 5-10 minutes, but they're really looking for companionship. So it's really emotional labor that we are talking about here. And the coronavirus actually is emotionally draining for all of us. And this is where I want to bring in Angelica and Dalena's paper about colonialism. So currently the form of colonialism is really neoliberal. So even for relatively privileged people like faculty members in the geopolitical West, the pandemic has caused us to basically have become like IKEA, right? You work at home, everything is at home. The college gives you a software program and you put the furniture all together. There's no support at all. So can we say something about these two types of labor? I would call it one, emotional labor. Second, a privatized labor.
Maybe I'm just looking at the time. The best way is to ask people to state their questions, the different kinds of labor, emotional and privatized, and then see if we have time to come back. So we'll mark Benny's question, Monica, and then there's a question by Althea and Michael on chat. You have to unmute, Monica.
Yeah. Thank you, Sione, and thank you, panelists, for your thought-provoking papers. I'm, of course, approaching this subject from the experience of India and the caste system, and I would first of all like to acknowledge that yes, touch is one among several senses that help us comprehend the world and to connect with the world. But touch is often limited or connected specifically to the body alone. So within the Dalit experience, when the Dalit person touches another individual from the dominant community, then it is a one-way communication. So the Dalit person pollutes the other individual, but what it does to the Dalit is not specified. So the untouchability or the polluting is always connected with the originating body, rather than it's not seen as a two-way process. Let me say that. So my question therefore is, do we have to locate touch only with the body or within the body, or do we go beyond it? That is one of my first questions. So the second thing is, within the Indian philosophical traditions, there's a distinction made between touch and contact. So while touch is limited, contact is wider, and contact is a two-way process. So I mean, Lim called attention to the woman with the issue of blood, and I think there the issue, for me at least, listening to all of you, the issue is more contact than touch, because there is a reciprocal. There is a response from Jesus. There's a power that that Jesus loses when the woman touches him. So I'd like us to think a little more in terms of any distinctions that we need to make between touch and contact.
Thank you. Does anybody? I think this comes to Gary's and Brian's question, Michael, and the panel. I mean, it's not just touch, but who touch whom and who is defiling whom.
Yeah.
Does anyone want to take that on? Or
I think I'm not going to take that question on, but I do want to point out that in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus also performs miracles without touching anyone. So the very first miracle about the unclean spirit, Jesus just spoke. In chapter 2, the paralyzed man, again, Jesus just spoke. The withered hand, Jesus just told him in chapter 3, just stretch out your hand, and it was done. And then in chapter 9, there was a child, the mute spirit. Jesus also just say, come out, and then it's done. So there was no touching involved at all in some of the miracle stories.
But you could say no physical touching involved, but he touched because he reached out. There was contact, there was communication. So I could see that as pulling the pieces together, that there was touch, not physical touch, but certainly touch that allowed there to be contact and relationship and communication to happen. When the question was posed, what I initially thought about was, as a woman, my body. And so the question about, is it important to know who is touching your body? And, the concerns that we have with good touch and bad touch, and the whole concern too with the agency that we have in being able to touch or allowing the other to touch us. And a lot of times our societies put barriers in place around touch and who is able to touch and what kind of contact is allowed. And we narrow a lot of times touch and contact to the sexual. So the gendered sexuality aspect comes in, and in a way that creates a barrier to us really being in touch, creates a barrier to us even communicating. And that's something that we may also need to spend some time parsing out, where notions of certain bodies can create barriers because we so narrow what those bodies mean, So you look at me and you see a woman and you think immediately, sex and that kind of thing. But then my humanity gets lost. And so when we are talking about who does the touching and then who desires to be touched, that's also something else that should come into play in the conversation.
Angelica?
And when I think, first, sorry for my Wi-Fi, now I'm on my phone. And when I think about the touching, and if you think about the Christian spirituality, the touch is giving dignity for the people. So it doesn't matter about the physical touch, as an example of Mark's gospel, but it's to give dignity. Like in the social movement that we are working here in Brazil, the point of food is important, because when you give food, it's not only an assistant, it's giving dignity for these people, it's giving hope for them. So the touching, in this case, in the pandemic, and even I think in this new normal, is to give dignity for the people, and not, and as Anna said, for the woman's body, for the racialized bodies. I thought about the untouchable, the Dalit community. I've been in India with WM, and to listen to stories, to understand the importance of the body, of the touch and dignity. So for me, I will put this word in the main center.
Theodore, there's a question from Althea.
Go ahead, Michael.
Well. Yeah, there's a question from another colleague, Althea, and I probably read it. So maybe it has been touched in different way. The question, that is, I appreciate the different kinds of touch that have been articulated. While holding them up, I focus on technology, touch, and disembodiment. In colonial times, enslaved persons were taught disapproval of their bodies based in ethnic bodies. Should we be suspicious of technology as disembodied touch? Where would that lead us? Should we be vigilant of the ways in which the pandemic leads us towards embodied distancing? How do we think about the role of the church in that historical Western experience? And then Althea wants to acknowledge the cultural particularity of Sunguk Kim's presentation.
Disembodied touch and embodied distancing. Leave it to Althea to raise such a question. Does anyone want to
Can I answer
respond
some
or engage?
of Penny and the others? First of all, you're right. Penny is right. Actually, kind of just healing is the best is not exclusively based on touch, right? But I'm just thinking about the kind of healing by touch. I believe just a spoken word may have the kind of the power to heal the others, but spoken words with touch maybe function more powerfully to the sick people and at the same time to the audience, because we can, even in the church, a pastor may pray for us in public, but sometimes they may kind of lay there and then they may kind of place their hands on our body. We can feel something, and then we can feel kind of the connection between one and the other, right? So I believe I just want to emphasize a kind of possibility of communication of emotion through kind of physical kind of contact. That's what I'm trying to emphasize in my paper. And at the same time, I do want to kind of engage with the question of Monica, and a touch is only kind of restricted to the body, or is it it goes beyond? I believe the body is a kind of symbolic body. It's a kind of physical body, right? And at the same time, it's a symbolic body. In the sense that the body kind of is a kind of representation of the social body. Therefore, when I kind of refer to the meaning of the touch, it just goes beyond the limitation of the body. I'm talking about kind of social body, okay, as a kind of from a kind of theological kind of perspective. So therefore, we have to think about the meaning of the touch. And then I love your question. How I will have to kind of because do more survey about the distinction between the meaning of touch and contact. I believe touch may be contact may be a broader concept to deliver the meaning of the touch that I'm originally trying to kind of spell out, but contact may be a broader concept of it. So let me try to kind of think about it and do more research on it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. So I love your great questions.
Thank you. It's obvious that we won't be able to answer all the questions, but I think it's helpful to hear as many questions as we can hear. So if we go to Monica, and Benny had several other questions, if you can just quickly raise your question and we'll reflect on those.
No, I just want to, take my argument forward a little bit, and that is, contact is a quality that is present in both the touched and the toucher. So when there is a contact between these two bodies, then there is a symmetrical relationship. Whereas when you use the word touch, at least again in the context of caste, it is a hierarchical relationship. Okay, because the one who pollutes is beneath the one who is polluted. So while touch is understood as a very specific human sense, contact is more a relationship between two entities or between two bodies. I'll stop there.
Okay, Benny, do you have one question for the panel?
Actually, I think I asked my second question. I mean, it has to do with the miracles that did not involve physical touching. So I do agree with Anna and Monica that we may have to further nuance what we mean by touch and parse that out further. But my third question has to do with a long history of scholarship within New Testament studies. That healing in the New Testament is not the same as curing. That healing actually has to involve a restoration to the community. So that really links back to Anna's paper about this social isolation, as well as Angelica's paper about Vivere, the communal well-being. So I think Sunguk just mentioned it, but I wonder if there's any way that we can also think and talk more about in the pandemic situation, what about the well-being as a social body, the term that Sunguk actually mentioned, because I think healing is not just curing a disease, but really is about a communal restoration.
Thanks for bringing that, Tatsiong. Not just a community, but the ecology. I mean, Bien Vivere is about getting to creation, and how do we find cure or healing or have something that also involves the creation. And I've got the notice from Peachy that time is running out. Time is out of touch, if we put it that way. But there's another question that I'd like to pose to the panel as you continue to think, that Michael Mawson has raised. How has COVID created an atmosphere wherein certain kinds of bodies are further marginalized and denigrated? And I think Anna spoke of dead bodies and those sex workers and those migrants and other bodies, and how COVID has kind of given, you know, the leaders of the US and the leaders of Brazil an excuse to continue to marginalize such bodies, not just Black bodies, but all. It seems like, you know, no body matters more than just their own body, and you know, they can get in a helicopter and get to the wing of the hospital in 2 seconds, whereas other bodies don't even have the that privilege to be tested. So this issue of body, and I want to thank all of you. I'm already over my time, so I apologize to Karen Georgia. As usual, this is going to be our tradition. We are not going to have a traditional prayer or traditional benediction, but a poet will bring us together. So, Karen Georgia, if you would kindly pull us together. Thank you.
Thank you. So this evening's response to what we have heard is called Intact, a reflection of what we've heard in our time together this evening. Life in fullness, life of flourishing, what a guan in these days. Touch is absent, fear chases away relationships, pandemics rendering all untouchable. Untouch the other and live. Untouch the other, resisting perceived dangers. Dead bodies having lost their mortal coil, having lost their respectability. Remind of the sacredness of an afterlife unknown. Remind of the creator and ancestors long gone. Touch not, handle not, some rendered unclean, desires for purity transcending empathy. No care for the suffering, no care for the dying. Years of exploitation, a pandemic of great proportion, economies once again a priority over living bodies. Hunger and poverty abound in great proportion, multiplied exponentially, resulting in fire and rage we see in the streets. Mortality is fragile, distance providing a mask of safety. Amidst a drastic scenario of mortal coils falling rapidly, sidestepped by societies, isolating those labeled different. Touching the sick, breaking down barriers, we reach out, defying historic boundaries and borders, the hands-off perpetuation of patriarchy itself a death knell, the touch a resistance to this living hell. At center are the exclusions, the attack on racialized and poor bodies, and exploitation of fault lines uncovered in our midst. Workers who are exploited by neocolonialism falling to disease named pandemics. Bodies lying in state, bodies devalued, bodies laid bare by pandemics left unchecked. Vulnerable lives deemed as working bodies display invisibility, a concept of social dis-ease. Dead bodies walking and ignored, lives of men and women in permanent economic quarantine. Contaminated by living, poor bodies turned away by a system spiritually bereft of compassionate response. Nobody cares for lives that don't matter, neopolitics dictating who lives and who dies. Unmask the virtual realities, open closed eyes to the unholy illusions of masked inequalities, of economies flourishing as they exploit the untouchable, of healing that can come in absence of touch. Healing that requires radical living, touch now bearing new meaning, touching across the miles, touching in new ways, touching to dismantle systems that isolate and reproach. Resist the
politicization of bodies. Resist the pollution of lives made pure by Creator. Resist the touch that violates. Resist the touch that brings hurt. Resist the narrow-minded thinking of touch, embracing new touch and contact that heals. Bodies are embodied by divine image, mortal coils connected to spirit without touch. Feel the interconnectedness, connected all living things. Move us to healing the created. We wait for the healing. We wait. Ashe.